Joe, always great to hear from you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Laura.
And Nick Little, who I first started working with on the Supply Chain Council, Nick and I had the opportunity to work with on the board. And Nick works at Michigan State, and I've got just ultimate respect for Michigan State and the work that they're doing there. And I actually traveled to South Africa with Nick, and he was telling me about the work that he's doing with educational associations around the world, and he'll talk a little bit about that. But he leads a consortium of over 600 educational organizations really looking at supply chain excellence and how we move it forward. Nick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to share the research, and I'm going to stop at 4 sections of the research, and I've got some questions that I'm going to ask my panelists at each of the sections. We'd also love to hear from you. So as I see the chat panel fill up with questions, I'll incorporate that in the dialogue. We want to have a dialogue around the research findings. So supply chain talent, I think it's the missing link in the future supply chain. You know, when we look at our research study, it was a quantitative study that we put out to people that we know and peer groups, and while we'll never share who answered the study, we will share the demographics, and it was really to see where are we on supply chain talents. This is the 2nd year that we've done this study, and we wanted to understand, are we getting better, are we worse, and what are the talent issues, and how are we facing global environments? And what we've seen is that there are 5 primary issues that are driving the discussion of talent. One is the retirement of the baby boomers. 2, we've got more demand than supply for young kids coming out of college. And, you know, Nick will say that he approximates that's about 6-to-1 demand to supply. 3, we're growing into global economies, and most of the talent is coming out of the North American and European schools, and we're really trying to build strong teams in Brazil and China and India, and so it's hard for us to get the talent in the right places. 4th, you know, good news for supply chain professionals, they're being asked to do more and step up. And 5th, you know, we have organizations that now just have a supply chain team, and they're trying to recruit. So all of these factors are causing some of the dynamics that we see in the research that we're going to show you. So when we look at a supply chain, right, and just to be clear, the people in this study, I had this kind of demographic. We find that 6 processes or functions overall are reporting to the supply chain leader. Most of the time, supply chain planning is in there, management of inventory, most often transportation and distribution, and to some degree sourcing. Less so customer service, manufacturing, and we were asking people to talk about the supply chain they know. So we just need to keep into context that people define supply chain very differently. We are noticing in our studies that the reporting relationships of supply chain is moving up to be more at a general manager P&L level, a chief operating officer level, as supply chains grow more important. Now, the study is biased in that we were able to capture feedback from very large companies, 40,000 employees on average. So this may not be typical of a mid-market manufacturer, but it definitely tells what we're facing as we move into the headwinds of the talent issues that we're facing. And it's a little bit more biased on process versus discrete industries. However, in my one-on-ones with companies, as I talk through this with discrete industries, we see similar patterns. So I think that that bias is okay. Most of the respondents were managers or directors with 16 years of supply chain experience on average, and it was more North American based in terms of where the respondents were actually answering the survey from. But many of the companies were actually responding for the global supply chains. Now, when we ask about talent and how talent ties into overall issues, it's rising up the stack in terms of how people see the overall issues of their supply chain. So we ask this question fairly consistently in surveys about what are your top 3 elements of business pain. And you know, the executive team understanding of supply chain has been ranking at the top of the list for the period of time we've been doing study after study. And the concept of the supply chain as a system with potential that needs to be managed very carefully, and talent is very tightly coupled to that, I think, lack of understanding. And then how we get actionable analytics and then clarity of supply chain strategy. We tend to have more high-level business strategy and assume we have best practices, but there's a layer that we need to fill in that is really around supply chain strategy. And then we have this question of talent, knowledge, and availability. So that's how we're seeing the overall issues that people that answered this questionnaire are struggling with today. Now, when we look at the talent issue, the biggest issue is really in mid-management talent. And I was teaching a class last week, and I put the slide up, and the person in the class said, that is the opposite of what we're working on. The person said, you know, we've got a lot of programs for entry-level people, and in fact, we see that almost a quarter of companies have very well-developed programs for entry-level people. And he said, we've got programs for high-performing people, the people that are seen as high performers, and, you know, we're going to be moved, hopefully, into executive-level positions. But he said, you know, in that mid-level where I'm at, you know, I see that training is tight, that budgets are being cut, and, you know, there isn't much focus on mid-management talent. And I think that is one of the issues that we're facing, because as we look at, you know, the self-assessment for companies, and we ask companies, how well do they do on talent? You know, 34% say they do worse than peers, and 17% say that they do better than peers. That's almost a 1-to-2 ratio. So Joe, when you think about, you know, talents, right, and we had these discussions, you know, in Indianapolis, does it surprise you that more companies feel they do worse than are really excelling in this area? And does the mid-management talent issue, do you see that? And how are you dealing with it?
Yeah, it does not surprise me that we have this bias 2-to-1 for worse, and it's actually a little bit encouraging because it says that we're probably pretty good at seeing reality. So I take it as great news. And it avoids this problem where everybody thinks they're better than average. So I think this is a great picture. You know, I do agree that this mid-level position is probably the area of greatest concern. I think that we've got a lot of great talent that's coming out of the programs at the university level. But, you know, if you think that what you really want in the middle are people that can lead horizontally or end-to-end, and people that can provide insight in terms of connecting ideas and capacities cross-functionally, that takes time. You know, we talk about 4 different things that are necessary to create an insightful mid-level supply chain manager. One of them is mastery. Another one is managing the complexity. A certain amount of it is time enrolled to learn the business, and then there's this whole integration piece. And I think that when you look at those 4 things and you look at the increasing complexity in our businesses, it makes sense that it's very difficult to fill those mid-level positions, not just in terms of the quantity or the number of positions, but really getting insightful leadership at those mid-level roles. So, yeah, I think the survey makes sense, and I think it's good news that we're seeing reality.
Thank you, Joe. And Nick, you do an awful lot of work with people that are in continuing education and MBA programs. How do you feel? I mean, do you think this reflects reality? Does it surprise you at all? And what do you think people should do about mid-management talent?
Well, firstly, the self-assessment does not surprise me at all. And I think the underlying factors beneath it are really well recognized. Yes, we're doing a good job at the entry-level position, much better than we were a few years ago. That's because a lot more universities now have supply chain courses of one description or another. However, the middle management are people that have been out in the business world for a few years. Some of them have been doing very traditional type of jobs, and they're finding it a little bit of a challenge to be able to change to a fully integrated view of the supply chain to deal with the four things that were just mentioned. And I think what's needed there is a recognition that perhaps the insights that they need to supplement their experience by getting some new knowledge is very, very important. And when you get into that middle management area, you move from a training environment into a learning environment. And it's very, very important that those people have the opportunity to get educated. Now, that area, when jobs become vacant, is probably the biggest risk exposure to a company when it looks at talent in the supply chain. And it's the biggest risk because it's the area where the largest number of people come together with the pretty high salaries that are out there at the moment. And that can give you a big financial exposure. It's also an area where we see a lot of companies actually recruiting people from outside and finding that they can't bring them on board the way they'd first thought because perhaps they don't have a good cultural fit. As high as 20% are reported to leave within the first few months and go elsewhere just because they don't fit. And then you've got to incur the expense of going through the whole recruiting process again. So the basic decision that's open to the HR folks there is, do we hire from outside or do we develop internally? And what we're seeing now is a lot of companies are saying, okay, we need to actually put people on a rotation program through middle management in many different parts of the business so that they get the mastery of the area that they're working in. They understand the complexity of making the business come together, and they can actually understand the markets in which the business operates and why the business is structured and behaves like it does. And then you've got to try and make sure that those people have the right skills. It's not just the types of skills that are traditionally taught, but it's a lot more things around relationships and so forth to develop that right form of capability that's necessary. Because without the capability, you can't hope to be a successful business. People are just so critical to the future success.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Marcia, you get to work with all functions, and, I love the work that you do. Are we different, or are we seeing this across other functions? And, how do you feel about the self-assessment? Are you there, Marcia? Let me I think we got to unmute Marcia. I can now. Thank you.
I see very similar things than Joe and Nick, and their perspective, I think, is absolutely illustrative of the larger challenge, because we could say those same things about many other parts of the business. The only place that surprises me a little bit is that I find consistently organizations feeling that they are lacking leadership capabilities at all levels of their employee ranks, perhaps with the exception of high performers. But I'm seeing increasingly organizations looking for those entry-level positions for people to at least have initiative, be able to make decisions, be able to justify why they're choosing to do the things that they're doing. And so while we may believe that leadership has really evolved in some ways, I'm seeing very consistently that question, are we thinking about leadership beyond management? And that, I think, is a big challenge for us. The two other areas where I see this gap in thinking not about the T skills, the hard skills, but about the larger skills are around collaboration and sharing. We have large parts of our workforce who are leaving our workforce or will be fairly soon, and are they doing a good job of sharing the wisdom of what they've learned back into the organization so that it doesn't walk out with them? And also on the business science side, where some of the analytics skills that may exist in silos, particularly in marketing or in finance, that we're seeing increasing need of having those analytics skills and thinking in a broad way, but also a deep way that is now almost a requirement for so many different parts of so many different types of business.
Well, and Marcia, I think many supply chains run on the backs of tribal knowledge and Excel spreadsheets. So that's a big issue for us. And you know, if we go on and we look at the current state, you know, we've got 15% turnover. 15% of the positions on average were open for the respondents, and 4 individual positions were open. And they're pretty painful. They're open for 5 months. I know that the first study that we did about the time that I started writing the book Bricks Matter, we were seeing this more like 2 months or 3 months. And so they're open for a fairly painful period of time. And when we ask what the positions were that were open, one of the patterns that I see, and Joe, I'm going to call on you because, you know, we're dealing with jobs that are staying open for a long time that require a level of technical mastery. So I've got to know some kind of technology and kind of deep process, but I've also got to know that business level, and I've got to understand cross-functionally. And a lot of people say, how do we get that in industries like chemical when we're doing more outsourcing and manufacturing? And how do we help people to understand the technical and the business mastery? First of all, does this surprise you? And secondly, any advice about, you know, how to close those gaps?
Yeah, so I think the next layer of questions are probably that we don't have those answers, but where are the positions most often staying open the longest? And my guess is there's probably certain geographies that are more problematic than others. I know
Absolutely.
In my own case, we're finding it very difficult in the Pacific region to fill openings and then to fill them with qualified candidates. You know, it's that combination. So I think there's a geographic impact here that matters. And it's not surprising at all that you're seeing this 3, 4, or 5 month opening for several positions. That could be my very own answers to this survey. So no surprise there. And I love the ones highlighted as the hardest to fill because, in my view anyway, these are the ones that are most cross-functional in nature and the ones that would require the most insight, especially the S&OP processes. And the fact that those, by definition, cross the functional lines in order to work well. And that means you have to have developed a business knowledge as well as an internal network so that you can have the influence necessary. Those sorts of things, they don't come from a new hire. And the same sort of comment with network planning, demand planner. And, you know, Nick's comment about how quickly you might hire someone, but then how long do they hang around? And I never would have believed that you could hire someone and lose them so quickly, but just last week in Europe, I learned of 2 candidates from very reputable programs who went to reputable companies, and within 1 month, they were both looking for a new position because that quickly they decided they landed in the wrong spot coming out of that program, and these were both mid-career sorts of hires. So I actually do believe this is a lot tougher nut to crack than maybe we gave it credit for. Great talent coming out of university programs, but this mid-level, particularly complicated roles, and you got to have some staying power to really start hitting the stride in those roles. So it's a tough one.
Well, Joe, we've got a question that's come in. You know, the respondent says, you know, clearly S&OP is difficult, but she's having some trouble with procurement. And, you know, what we see are the supply chain execution roles in these last 2 years of studies, people are having an easier time filling. Are you also having trouble with procurement?
You know, it depends which pieces of procurement. So if your organization, in our case, is set up very functionally and procurement is assigned, you could say once there's a decision on which source you want and what specification you want, and you get purely to the negotiation portion of the process. So it depends how it's divided up. We happen to have that functionalization, but in our particular business unit in the AgroSciences arena, we found that kind of strict functionalization did not work so well. And so we had to integrate those procurement folks from the larger corporation into the business teams in order for them to really do their jobs well. That's where we have this huge benefit pulling from a larger organization. And so we're finding it easier to fill those positions, mainly because we're getting them from another part of Dow where they have a large number of procurement experts, and then the only thing they need to learn is the business piece. So they bring a bunch of skills already on board that they've got. And so you accelerate the learning curve quite a bit, but obviously that's not a situation that everyone has access to depending on your corporation. But you said that the folks in this survey are at the 40,000 employee level, so my guess is that a lot of people on the call have access to that same sort of an arrangement where high growth in one business unit can be kind of supported from a larger organization.
But what I see is a lot of times people have very functional type of progression, and when they try to hire into a very deep function, they have problems. Joe, let me ask you another question. You said regions of the world. Is one region of the world more problematic than another for you right now?
In terms of talent and filling positions, absolutely. Pacific is the spot that's giving us the greatest degree of difficulty, followed by Latin America. We seem to be having the easiest path, and I wouldn't call it easy. It's just easier than the other two with North America and Europe. But Pacific in particular, you have a lot of competing industries there. And so you might have a very hot petrochemical sector down in New Zealand. And so if you're trying to fill supply chain positions in our business in New Zealand, you have the competitive salaries in petrochemical that you're up against, in addition to access to talent. In China, it feels like sometimes a bit of a revolving door in terms of training. And the mode of operation there seems to be go get an experience in a company for a bit and then move on to another company, because that's the model, at least, that seems to be viewed over there by many of the young folks in their careers, is moving companies is the best way to get promotions and move up that salary food chain. So I would say that's the toughest region for us.
Okay. Now, Nick, I know you're working with universities around the world. When you look at this and you see, okay, business mastery, technology mastery, gaps in regions of the world, because we also do see in the study and some of the slides that China and some of the areas in Asia were some of the toughest to recruit into. What's your response? How do we go about solving this?
We've really got a couple of different options. What a lot of organizations are doing when they're looking at new hires and trying to fill the gaps at that end into some of those tasks that are in the green area at the top of this chart, then they can either find those people from university programs, although it's pretty hard in the Pacific area and other parts of the world, or they can hire good people in different functions and retrain them. And that's what we're actually hearing a lot of people are doing out in the Pacific area. They're picking up engineering graduates and then saying, you've got a bit of acumen for business, we're going to retrain you to do procurement, or whatever it might be. But that's really not solving the problem. It's not addressing the root cause. It's really dealing with the symptoms. And what we've really got to do is we've got to look at this chart. This chart is a fantastic chart, Laura. I think you've done a great job here because it tells such a wonderful story. At the top of the chart, you've got all the well-established areas of supply chain, and then at the bottom, you've got some of the more recent skills that are characterized by the fact they're specific to a particular organization's business model. They're more cross-functional in nature, much more integrative, and they require a certain amount of experience. Now, those are the areas that you've got to say, okay, we need to give people continued support and training for those. And that type of support is going to vary around the globe according to local custom, local culture, and the local market conditions for what people can move to. And we're finding that there's an awful lot of opportunity now for people to learn by distance methods, using online programs to get supply chain certificates that weren't there just a few years ago. So I would see that these skills have now got the opportunity to develop much better than they did before. And I would hope to see that the gap begins to close by people being directed to those types of online learning opportunities. And we'll see the gap, I hope, beginning to close. At the same time, the total scale is probably going to get larger because, as you said in the introduction, there are a lot of companies now who are just coming into the supply chain field. They're recognizing it is a strategically critical part for their business, and they've got to have some people in there. So they're going to have to start recruiting, and that's going to put additional pressure on finding those people, and it'll put an upward pressure on salary as well. So that'll have an impact on future budgeting for supply chain resources.
I agree, and Nick, when I reviewed this with supply chain leaders, a couple of people have told me what's working for them is moving people initially in mid-management into the procurement, buying, transportation planning, customer service roles, and then moving them through and building the technical and the business mastery. And some companies are even saying that, you know, the ability to support people in China, maybe they'll have somebody in North America or Europe backfill that role, or maybe they'll look at staff augmentation. Are you hearing anything else, or does that resonate for you?
That certainly does resonate. We do hear that some companies are really getting quite aggressive in the way they structure people's careers now, and are saying, unless you've worked 2 years in China, unless you've worked a certain time in Australia, South America, wherever it might be, you're not going to be able to progress to a top-level job, because you're not going to have enough understanding of the business, enough experience of working in different markets and different cultures to be able to be a fully rounded good leader in the future. And so they're actually making those as distinct requirements for people within their organization to actually fulfill before they can be considered for promotion to the top level. And it's not just functional, it's geographic as well, is the point. And that seems
Marcia, yeah, thank you, sorry. So Marcia, when you think about, you know, bringing people in and, you know, education and training and learning, you know, adult learning is, you know, something you specialize in. You know, what advice do you have for people that, you know, are looking at mid-management and have to tackle this adult learning problem?
Well, speaking directly to the point Nick made a few moments ago, is that we're talking about learning, not training. The idea of actually thinking about our mindset is that when you're working with adults in your organization, there has to be a different thinking, that we're not looking for a sterile room and everybody sitting down and facing forward. But you have those examples where people need to be getting out, being in other countries, of actually experiencing that, to be able to gain the experience, to be able to apply it to the right problems at the right time. The basic concept of learning, actually, not just for adults but of all ages, is that we take information in, we make it our own, and then we have to reflect on it. And if we look at what is adult learning and how we can actually benefit from those three things, is that I find most organizations are pretty bad, frankly, at helping people. They're pretty good at actually helping people take new information in, but they stop there. There's very little understanding what people already know, for example, of doing just, you know, somewhat of assessments of just figuring out the gap between what they know and what they need to know to be quite successful in the role. And then to give them both the time, and even when time isn't available, the space mentally to be able to think broadly and reflect on what they're learning, and to be able to think about it and seeding it in new sorts of ways. All of what I could say we've been talking about is leveling up our workforce. Being able to bring people in, possibly off the street or from, you know, a competitor, and raising their capabilities to the next level. And people are far more capable of doing that than we have given them credit for. But we have to meet them where they are, and we have to give them the credit for having these, you know, natural capabilities to learn more things. So focus on how people actually take in information, make it their own, and reflect on it, and recognize that greater than 80% of all learning in a corporate setting is informal, and it doesn't come from a training class or even a formal, intentional effort. And it's our job to figure out where they are learning today and how we can make that richer and more robust and more helpful to get them where we need them to be.
Well, Marcia, you know, I do a lot of work with companies, and I'll often go in, and they're companies that have hired people from the outside, and maybe they got somebody from Unilever, and maybe they got somebody from Dow, sorry, Joe, maybe they've got somebody from, I don't know, DuPont, or, you know, but we've got very different supply chain experiences, and people sitting around the table think that they know supply chain best, right, that they know the business mastery, that they came from, you know, a company that, you know, did it well. And Joe, one of the things that I see is often at play there that's problematic is really helping people to get on the same page in terms of supply chain strategy and to get clear around what's important in this new business and to get them acclimated and give them time. Do you see that as well, and what is your insight there?
Yeah, well, first let me just say I wish I had more insight there, because I mentioned these 4 things that are required to have genuine insight. Fundamentally, it takes a bit of time, and you have to have great relationships in your business teams, and you have to have cross-functional time to reflect. And I think the you know, the traditional approaches are you know, they're easier to grasp, they're easier to handle within a function, but to really start going end to end in how value is seen or extracted, I think it takes a longer amount of time. So, you know, I see our mid-level supply chain leaders encroaching in that space. In other words, being incrementally effective in broadening the conversation, but it only happens after there's a great deal of trust that the traditional fundamentals are taken care of. And so I don't have a recipe. I wish we could come up that curve quicker, but it just seems to take time in order to build the rapport and in order to kind of guarantee the old fundamentals before you can have these cross-functional, enlightened discussions. This idea that 80% of the learning happens on the job, that doesn't seem to stop us from continuing to try and compartmentalize modules to accelerate the learning, but it just doesn't seem to have an impact on what I would call genuine insight.
Now we have a question, Joe, from the audience about ROI, you know, how you justify training programs. And in the study we see that in the past there was training around the adoption of a new technology. So maybe people were putting in an ERP and they had training, but we've actually seen monies for training to start to be cut back. And the question is, how do you justify the ROI? Any insights there?
No, in our organization, we've not even headed down that path of attempting to increase a training budget and allege an ROI on particular training. We have a certain degree of commitment to it, but I would call that official training expense small enough that we usually don't talk too much about it. So kind of to Marcia's point, 80% happens in the role, on the job. So an example of that would be travel. And I just returned yesterday from an around-the-world junket for a couple of weeks, and quite serendipitously, one of those conversations was me and a room full of commercial people talking about different aspects of our S&OP process and some of the tools we use in that space, and discovering that we had a fundamental disconnect. We were looking at the same words on the paper and in the work process, but defining them differently. So each camp was perfectly clear, except they were clear about 2 opposite ideas. And so we started this conversation and literally uncovered a mechanism for that group to start looking at demand a little bit differently and making it visible across the organization differently. And so my guess is that we probably have, and I'm going to throw out a number, maybe 1 million or more of sales opportunity that we were missing, simply because of two different perspectives not being aligned, and the way it got aligned happened to be a plane ticket and a visit. It was not something that was ever thought about in a training budget, and unfortunately, all too often, companies go to things like travel as the first things to cut if they want to save a little money. But in a cross-functional world, that travel budget is probably every bit as important, and maybe more so than the training budget, because today the opportunities are found more cross-functionally, and you have to get some face time in order to make that happen. So I would say look at travel and face-to-face expenses just as much as one is looking at a training budget if you're really trying to amp up connectivity and value discovery.
Right. Now, Nick, you talked about these positions at the bottom are really kind of evolving, right? Demand planning, S&OP, and we've got a lot of organizations. We've got Apex, we've got ISM, we've got industry organizations, we've got academics, but it seems to me that we're out of sync, that the process evolution is not happening at the same rate, that the understanding of those processes is happening in associations and industry associations and even academics. What's your perspective, and how do we step up to this plate?
I think you're hitting on a very important observation here, Laura. And just something that Marcia said earlier made me think a little bit more deeply about this and call up some experience I've had. The problem with training is that it's very much looking for a standard process and then getting people to adopt to the standard process. That's clearly not what we need. What we need are people that are able to think through things. And rather than prescribing solutions to them, I think education and professional associations need to really take a different view. They need to help people solve problems for themselves. And what I mean by that is they need to be able to express to them the concepts and the standards where they exist, but get the concepts and the standards to the folks and then have them put it in their own context. And what that enables them to do is apply the learning to their own particular issues, their situation, and their company's strategy. And then you begin to be able to pick up a very good read for the return on investment that's put into it, and you can judge that not just in financial terms, but you can see changes in behavior. Because at the end of any sort of education, there's got to be a behavioral change, doing stuff better, doing a lot more of the communication, the difficult communication that leads to good integration. Those are the types of things that you've really got to see people pick up and deal with themselves. And people can do it. You've just got to give them the chance. All too often, we're too busy fighting fires, and we're never having the opportunity to stand back and say, how can we look at this and do things differently?
Right, and Marcia, one of the things I love that you do really well is that gap analysis. I know you've got to leave in a couple of minutes, but how would you go about telling people how to really get at the gap analysis and start to do this kind of learning?
Well, what Nick just alluded to was what is considered proximate development, that you can figure out what people know already and then how far that stretches for them to be able to do what they need to do now. And that's the critical gap. The very common sense example I use is the first time you got in an airplane and somebody and you knew you had to put on a seatbelt. You probably did that before somebody showed you how to do it, because you'd put on a seatbelt in a car before. And though they may have been fundamentally different, or the experience, the context was different, you knew how to do it and you could transfer it over to another situation. I use that particular example because it's one I find that people can explain, even in the workplace. And they can say, you know, you did something like this in your previous job, or ask them, what have you done like this in your previous job? And start to understand how much different that is from what you do now. We all do things just a little bit differently in our organizations. And you can do that in a formal process. Ask the person who is the very, very best at this, and then ask the person who's pretty darn good, but maybe not the best, because they may be a more accurate meter in this case. And ask them, what are all the things that they absolutely have to know? What are the experiences that were seminal in their development? And then use that to go back to people and ask them the question, how far are you from this? And have them be able to prove that. That's not in any sort of threatening or bullying way, but just simply ask the question, what are some things that you could do to be able to get to the point where you could do this? Maybe it is even a book, or a trip, or a class, or a conversation. And you can be far more creative and ingenious in how you meet that gap.
Well, thank you, Marcia. I know you've got to run. We're going to continue here. And so, you know, if we look at the gaps in training, you know, and where people are looking at the solutions or the things that they're trying to do to attract and retain employees, the greatest gap are around this more holistic training, either, you know, cross-training of existing employees or training for, you know, what's happening on the job, and really getting their hands around this gap analysis. Joe, any insights here?
Yeah, you know, when I look at this, it causes me to think of this conversation we've had around our workforce profile strategy. And I don't know if these fractions are correct, but we talk about a third, a third, a third. And what we think about, I don't know that we aim for it, but we talk about it enough to know that it matters to the to the performance of the team. But 1/3 being sort of homegrown functional specialists, and so maybe the model there is out of a university program, you hire someone with a supply chain discipline, and then they come into the company, and perhaps they stay in that supply chain capacity for their career. Another third would be planned cross-functional moves, and I don't mean planned too rigorously, but just, yes, make sure they happen. And by that I mean someone comes from manufacturing or someone comes from commercial, but they come into supply chain and then stay. And then a third of the organization being passed through. I think that any role in the team structure can be looked at and those three things put in some kind of a balance. I think at a macro level, those thirds might be right, but for any given role, it probably needs some examination to decide what the right optimum balance is between those three kinds of approaches. And then I see this chart that you've got on the screen right now, and my attention is drawn to this cross-training for existing employees. And how you can have a workforce strategy that accomplishes these things sort of by design, as opposed to saying you've got a fixed organization, now how do we get them cross-functionally trained? Actually have your labor strategy or your workforce strategy designed to give you that cross-functional mix.
And I think particularly around these areas where we're seeing so much business pain around demand planning, S&OP, and network analysis, where not only are those shortages, but those processes are evolving, and I think it requires us to do more cross-training, but also more understanding of that. Nick, any insights here about, you know, how to work with universities or people that you've seen do this well?
Well, certainly one of the things that universities do is get their students out on internships so they can see different parts of an organization. I reckon that any company thinking of hiring somebody ought to make that internship something that's very valuable to the student, but also valuable to the company, because if they've got a possibility of hiring that person in the future, it's their opportunity to really test them out, see how good they are, and put them in different situations, in different functions as well. And then what I'm seeing is that some companies now are doing very good rotational 2- or 3-year programs for their new hires to give them exposure in a lot of different parts of the supply chain business, and some time in marketing, some time in manufacturing, some time in even in finance, so that they can, when they put them in a job after they've been with the company for a couple of years, they can have a much better understanding of how the company functions, what all the different organizations do. They've got their network of contacts developed, which is absolutely critical to be a good performer. And those people are doing incredibly well. The downside to it is that a lot of those companies find that those really good people get headhunted within the first 5 years of having them. But to me, that's not a bad thing. That's telling the world that you're doing a good job with people development, and shouldn't be something that you should shy away from.
Well, I think we've had this assumption that we can retread employees, that, you know, if we have a shortage, we can just go to the open market. And I think that's a fallacy. When I look at the results of the study, people are not doing very well going out to the open market right now. And so being able to do cross-training and backfill and taking ownership of talent, I think, is really essential. But let's wrap up a little bit. So in the study, we had some questions around a supply chain HR department, and people had at 6 years on average, and actually, you know, it's not statistically correlatable, but there's a trend that the people that did have a supply chain HR department would self-assess themselves better on the earlier question. The demographics is not such that we can say that definitively, but I do see that trend in talking to clients. And, you know, when we look at, you know, where the money is going and the established programs for training, and I love Marcia's perspective on how people learn and the fact that there's focus should be on learning, not on training. But, you know, we do have many companies that have it as part of a new hire organization or part of a progression program, but a lot of people leave it up to the individual. And, you know, and I think that encouraging learning and encouraging mastery is really important in career progression. And when we look at where people feel that they need cross-training, it isn't always in sort of those traditional supply chain roles of source, make, deliver. A lot is into strategy and finance and, you know, some of the things that, you know, kind of surprised me that kind of came up at the top of the heap here. Joe, your thoughts here about attacking this problem?
Yeah, what we've started recently is something that we've called developmental temporary assignments, and very specifically looking at cross-geographic moves. And I think Nick mentioned this earlier, and he said something that reminded me of expat assignments. And at least in large corporations, my experience is they are extremely expensive to manage. And sometimes you just have to admit that that's the model you're running, but very expensive. What we've started to do the last 3 years is talk about 4 to 8 week assignments, and very specifically across geographies, and doing that to expose people to these topics of distribution and strategy, how marketing is done and how sales happen in different regions, and how some of the work processes that we sometimes call global standards, but how they get interpreted locally and done differently. And we've had pretty good luck with those short-term assignments, both in terms of being able to bury the cost of it. You don't have to, you know, have an act of God to try and get budget to do these things. You can often absorb it. And then the learning that comes from it in more ways than we even initially expected. It's having an impact on kind of bringing the global group together more than we ever could have through, you know, a face-to-face meeting with the global team every 3 years or something like that. So that's one approach that I think has been particularly successful for us.
Yeah, you know, and when Nick was talking about co-ops, and I was thinking about some of those, you know, specialized programs that you're running. You know, Nick, any thoughts here around cross-training or development, or working with educational facilities?
Well, certainly there's tremendous opportunity to work with both professional associations who tend to be more specific in the area they cover, and educational institutions that have a wider remit. You know, if you come to a well-established business school, then you'll have people that deal with all the key functions, and you can actually get folks in a room and you can talk about how those different functions relate to each other. You can bring strategy to life with case studies and things like that that can help people learn. But what happens is people have got to come with an open mind, and it's important that the organization make sure that when people go to an educational seminar, they're not going to get solutions. That what they're actually going to get is ideas. And they've got to take those ideas back to their workplace, and they can take cross-functional ideas, modify them for their own organization, and put them into practice. And we see a lot of organizations that are very, very successful in creating the right environment for people to do that. We also see that there are large organizations now of the sort of size in your survey who are bringing people from all over the world to get together in a group to open up some of the opportunities that they've got. They've got islands of excellence in their organization, and what they're trying to do is to turn those into what I call continents of brilliance. And they've got the answers in their own organization. They need a bit of facilitation and a bit of leading to help unlock what's already there.
I couldn't agree more. I had the great opportunity early on as an analyst to meet a guy by the name of Dick Clark who worked for Procter & Gamble. And Dick was spending 3 years traveling the globe to look at facilitation of terms like what is forecasting, and how do we measure forecast performance, and what does the S mean in S&OP, and what does supply chain strategy mean. And Dick's now gone. Unfortunately, he had a death, but I remember the conversation with him, and I said, Dick, why is it taking you 3 years? It just doesn't make sense to me. And he said, well, we have to learn first, to then unlearn, to relearn, and then to calibrate. And it requires people face-to-face and really, really focused on process mastery and building those trusts and relationships. And I was like, but can it be done faster, Dick? And can it be done, by video conference or web conference? He said, no, unfortunately, Laura, it's the nuance that really gets us. And so, Joe, when you were talking about, the travel and getting people together and, getting at some of these cross-training, I was thinking back to my conversation with Dick. So thank you very much for joining us today. I want to just close that it is my belief that talent is the missing link in the supply chain, that supply chain processes are evolving, and that we need to really calibrate people and to really think about how we deal with supply chain, not as a function, not as business as usual. We can't just retread and assume that we can go to the open market for people, that we've got to take responsibility for our supply chain and build talent. So we will be continuing this discussion at our Supply Chain Global Summits. We have a great talent panel, and Nick and Joe are going to be on the panel along with Cindy from ISM, and it'll be led by Jake Barr from Procter & Gamble, who's done some great work with talent development, and also IBM will be joining that panel, and I think you'll get some great perspective. We'd love to see people at our Global Summit. We appreciate our panelists joining us today, and we encourage people to continue to learn in our next webinar, which will be on the evolution of supply chain performance and the work that we've done on the index, which is leading us to the work that we're going to be doing on the Global Summit. It's our commitment at Supply Chain Insights to provide research that helps to elevate the thought-leading supply chain discussion. And I think we accomplished that today, and I appreciate the panelists. Have a great day. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Laura.
Constance, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Laura, Joe, Nick, and Marcia for participating in today's Supply Chain Talent webinar. Be sure to check out the Supply Chain Insights Talent Research Report on our website, supplychaininsights.com/research. We are happy to provide the report to you for free and for you to share with your colleagues and network. Next up is Supply Chain Metrics That Matter and a preview of what we will be sharing at the Global Summit. That webinar is August 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up on our website today. Thank you for attending today. See you next time on the Supply Chain Insights webinar series. Have a great day.